Hi, today I'm going to talk a bit about storage options for the Radio Shack color computer. Now if you have a Coco and you don't have a way to save files, you'll know it gets boring fast. You're going to need some way to save the stuff that you type in if you're programming. The traditional option is to use floppy disk. Here's a 5¼ inch floppy disk. It is the most authentic way to save files on a Coco. Problem with the floppy disk is the floppy disks are indeed floppy. They're not that robust. The other problem with floppy disks is they don't make them anymore, so you might find some used on eBay, but who knows the condition they're in, whether they're going to save your files or not. One thing to note is that I've had a lot of floppy disks from like 30 years ago that still work fine. They're more robust than you'd think as long as they've been put in the sleeve, but if you pull them out of the sleeve and let dust get on them, you can lose data quickly. To pick up a floppy drive system, you're looking probably about $100 for the drive and another $100 for the controller. So, you might be looking $200 to get a floppy drive set up. It's affordable, but it's, not cheap, and depending on how much you like your Coco, might not be worth the money. Your second option is a drive emulator, such as this HXC emulator. This unit is $81 US. It emulates a floppy drive electrically, so it looks exactly like a drive to the controller. It will emulate a 35-track drive, a 40-track drive, an 80-track drive, whatever you want, which is really handy. And it will work in computers other than the Coco, because it's just a plain old floppy drive. It'll work on, your Model 4, like I use it on my Model 4. It'll work on IBM clones, all that sort of stuff this thing will work on. Disadvantage to it is you still need a disk controller, and you also need a power supply for it. So by the time you're done, you end up spending, about $200 in order to get this. If you want a case for it, you might be spending another $50. So you might be looking at $250 to get this sort of emulator working. The last option I'm going to take a look at today is the Coco SDC, which is really the most popular emulator for the Coco right now. The Coco SDC is about $70 with the case. It plugs right into the side of the Coco, and it has an SD slot on the side and cartridge slot on this side. So it's quite an elegant solution. Here's three of the main options that we have for persistent storage on a Coco. The first is the legacy floppy drive. So this one is particularly legacy because it's actually a full height drive. Weighs, 3-4 pounds. And you're dependent on this media, which is a floppy diskette. These diskettes are actually getting harder and harder to find, even though these were, the king of media in the 1980s, 5¼ inch floppy. They didn't really have a lot of staying power, because if you think about it, maybe from 1978 or so they became popular, and I think they pretty much fell out of use 1988, 1990, something like that. So 12 years they were popular media. There's not that many of them left. You got to find used ones, or you got to find new old stock, and they're expensive. Now, another problem with this media is that there is a big hole here on top of, so you can actually read the data. And if you get dust on there or a fingerprint, well, there's a good chance your media is no longer going to work. So that's another problem why this sucks. And I remember, using these day to day as a kid and having I/O errors on my diskettes for my favorite game or whatever software project I was working on, and it was extremely frustrating. So, the media is not so robust here, and that's a problem with a full height drive, or any drive for that matter. So the second option is the HXC floppy disk emulator. This is a great little device. It 100% emulates a floppy disk. It has a header, just like a 3½ inch drive does, and that means it's compatible with the cabling for the 5¼ inch drive. You can emulate a 35-track single-sided drive like you have on the Coco, or you can even emulate a double-sided drive, 40-track, 80-track, whatever you want. And as long as your OS on the Coco will handle it, you can use that extra storage as a floppy drive. So it's really handy. It is, seems to be roughly the same speed as a floppy disk. It even has a little buzzer on the side here that makes a head seek noise like a floppy drive does, which is quite a cool little retro effect. Yeah, and it's basically, you know, a nice little compact unit. The problem with it is that it comes like this. And so, you know, as a raw board, they do have cases available, but the cases add up, you know, as far as cost is concerned. And the problem is with the Coco, you know, everything's external. So now, you know, you buy an external case, you've got more wires, you've got a power supply, you got all sorts of stuff, and it becomes, you know, messy. You have the same problem with the floppy drive, full-size floppy drive, but like it's 2018 and I don't really want to have Coco wires running around my office all over the place and having to explain to my wife what the heck that thing is with all the wires. That I don't like about this unit. Other than that, it's great. You know, SD card. It's a nice system. Stores, you know, as much data as you're ever going to have on a Coco. So the final option is the Coco SDC. Coco SDC is a nice compact, you know, single piece of kit here. It just plugs in the side of the Coco. You've got an SD card on the side here. Pop that in, away you go, and you have basically, you know, as much storage as you'll ever need on a Coco. I think the entire library of Coco software ever written is something like 500 megs or even less. I mean, it's like crazy. So, you know, any old SD card will do. You can have multiple backups of your SD cards and, you know, you're ready to go there. There's a few mode switches on the top. There's a drive, I think there's a drive change switch on the side. I think that's what that's for. And basically it's nice and clean because it just plugs into the side of the Coco and away you go. Now, with these two drive units, you need a drive controller still. So this is what plugs into the side of the Coco, and you've got yourself a cable here that plugs into the drive unit. With these guys, you know, you're gonna need this. You're gonna need the drive or the drive emulator, in addition to, you know, cables and power and all that good stuff. From a cleanliness standpoint, certainly the Coco SDC is, you know, the clear winner here. It's just nice and compact and small. Going to take a quick look at what makes up these units. So basically on a floppy drive, you've got a lot of old style logic chips, some amplifiers. There's actually, you know, a magnetic signal, which could be almost thought of as like an audio signal that's being recorded on the disc. So there needs to be amplification, and that's sent out this connector on the back. The floppy disk itself is completely stupid. I think the commands on this line are basically go to this track, go to that track, or in fact it's go to the next track, go to the next track. So it doesn't, you know, have any memory or anything exciting in it. It's really just about controlling the floppy drive motor and the location of the head itself. The HXC has to emulate a physical device, so it's got a few more things on it. It's got a little display screen here, and if I pull that off, there we go. You can see underneath here is a big microcontroller. This is a PIC microcontroller. PICs I'm not a fan of. I don't know how to program them. They use a slightly different paradigm. It's quite low level as far as I know, and I think there's like inherent multi-threading in them, so they're a bit difficult to work with, so not a big fan. And then we've got a little digital logic chip on the side there. Basically what's happening here is you've got your floppy drive signals, you've got this chip emulating all those signals and the performance, and then reading this SD card. There's 3 buttons here to scroll through the menus, and I'll show you how those work a bit later in the video. So pretty straightforward, just a microcontroller. Now I'm going to pull apart the Coco SDC. Now I got mine with the case. The case is an option. It's pretty cheap. Worth buying if you want to get this. And we'll take a look at the Coco SDC, and in it we've got 2 Xilinx FPGAs. These are emulating both the floppy drive and the controller itself. I don't know which does which, or if that responsibility is split between them. And then we've got a static RAM chip here, or an EEPROM, and this is storing your ROM images. So that's where your operating system is stored. And then we've got a little fun Atmel chip here, which looks like a 328 off the top of my head. So this is basically the chip from an Arduino. And that's a good thing because I really am an Atmel fanboy. I love these guys. So it's nice to see it being used there. And then you can see headers on this side. Looks like they're gold plated. And that's about it. Headers on the bottom. So pretty straightforward. So one thing about a traditional floppy is that you have all the brains of the floppy in the controller itself. This guy here is your standard floppy disk controller. There's a ROM chip which has the operating system, so this has RS-DOS. And then you've got some digital logic chips here to provide the integration between the bus basically and this chip here. Typically on a cartridge like this, there's going to be a set of digital logic chips to have it activate based on when certain addresses are coming up high on the cartridge slot. And I'll explain that in some other video maybe. But basically, you know, it's this chip here. Now this chip is a 1793 chip. 1793 is a controller that, you know, was basically used in the vast majority of home computers at the time. It is really the brains of this whole thing, and you know, the interfaces that it used map very closely to what you actually program to on the computer. This chip, you know, was used, and versions of this chip were used in different controllers for, you know, 20 years. One thing to note is that there's two versions of the Coco controller. The early versions required 12 volts. I believe it's because this controller chip required 12 volts at the time. Now that's a problem because a Coco 2 or a Coco 3 don't provide 12 volts. Only a Coco 1 does. So if you're buying this, you decide to go the floppy route or the emulated route, you know, check the controller, make sure it's a new model controller that runs off of 5 volts if you're using a Coco 2 or Coco 3. Otherwise, you're going to have a bit of work to do in order to get the thing working. You're going to need to provide your own 12 volt power source. Booting up into the Coco SDC is super easy. Just turn it on and away you go. If you do a dir dash, that will give you a list of all the files on the SD card itself. So you can easily see what disks you have on that SD card, and you can mount any of them just by going drive and then pick your drive number, 0, list your file name. So I'm going to say BBS, and there we go, it's mounted. And now if I type dir, I get my BBS software. So it really couldn't be any easier to use. It's just totally simple. One great thing about this ability to just do a dir dash is keeping track of your files. If you're from the floppy era, one major problem we always had was, you know, you get 100 floppy disks, you have to label them somehow. So on this disk, you know, it's been labeled with games, Cosmic, Galaxy, Decath, I presume that's Decathlon, Sargon 2, and Missile. You know, that works when you've got a small collection of disks. When you have hundreds of disks, it becomes a complete nightmare. And so, you know, one of the solutions that we used to do is we used to print little labels with the directory output and put them on the folder for the floppy disk. But, you know, those labels would just get out of date. It was just a nightmare. This system is a lot easier to use. It's just, you know, disks are right there. You name them appropriately. You've got tons of storage, so you can have, you know, you're not trying to put a whole bunch of disk images, you know, a bunch of programs onto the same disk. You can just, you know, have one disk image for each program. A lot easier to sort out. So I really like that about the system. So if we try loading a file, you know, the Coco SDC is quite quick. I'm just going to load the menu program here, and you know, you click enter and it loads, you know, within a second or so of actually hitting the command. So I like that. You can mount whatever image you want into the drive slots. So I'm going to go drive 0, BBS, and then I'm going to go drive 1, B traders. And then if I go dir 0, there's my BBS, dir 1, There's Battling Traders, which is a Trade Wars clone, which is, you know, one day going to be finished. It's going to be just the most awesome thing ever. Me and my friend Rob have been saying that since 1986 or 87. We'll see if it gets finished. There's a problem, and this is one thing I really don't like about the Coco SDC, is that I can't mount a third disc into a drive 2 or drive 3. So if I go drive 2 and then try to load New World, drive number error. Same thing with drive 3. New World, drive number error. Drive 4 doesn't really exist in the Coco, but we can see if, you know, maybe it's been hacked. We can mount that. Drive 4, again, drive number error. The problem is the Coco SDC only allows you to mount SD images on drive 0 and drive 1. This is like perfect for 90% of users, but for someone like me, my big project that I'm always working on or always talking about working on is the BBS and, you know, BBS software. I really want to have as much online storage as possible, and I want it to be 35 tracks because I don't want to deal with, you know, different drives, image sizes, and the potential risk of losing data because, you know, I accidentally worked with a 80 track image on 35 track mode. So this is a pain. This is a nightmare. And I looked online for source code for either the firmware or SDC DOS. I didn't find it. Maybe it's out there, but I mean, this, you know, I just don't like this. This is a major fail as far as I'm concerned. Now, drive 2 and drive 3 are designed with the Coco SDC to use DriveWire. DriveWire is great. DriveWire allows you to set up a server on a Windows box or a Linux box and, you know, have as many disk images as you want. You've got, you know, your terabytes of hard drive storage. You can just have everything there. You can network it. It's all great. It's a fantastic piece of code. However, when I've got 8 gigabytes of storage on an SD card, on the cheapest SD card I could find, I don't need DriveWire. I don't want DriveWire. I don't want to worry about it. I don't want to use my serial port up with, you know, with the DriveWire cable. I just want to have everything online on my SD card. And I think that this is pretty sucky. I really don't like that. So, you know, everything so far about the SDC, Coco SDC has been fantastic. This sucks. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how you change media on a floppy drive. Basically, you know, pull it out, and away you go. Put your right disk in there. I've already talked a little bit about how this is inconvenient because it's very difficult to tell what's actually on those floppy disks. The HXC unit uses an SD card. I've got a really old 2 gigabyte card in there. And if you power up the HXC, let's plug power there, it boots up and it reads the file startup.a.hfe. The HXC emulator uses a special file format called HFE. The HFE format is great because using that format you can emulate, you know, any drive type you want. You can emulate a 160 track drive, you can emulate an 80 track drive, a 40 track drive, a 35 track drive, whatever you want, it'll emulate it. It's fantastic. The problem is there's custom software that you need to use in order to convert your disk images over to HFE. And to get files in and out of the HFE file, you have to use this custom software. The UI is not that great on it. It's a pain. You can't just copy files to the SD card and have them work with this unit. It just does not work that way. That's a huge problem when you compare the convenience of the Coco SDC and, you know, the HXC unit, is that you're, you know, always going into this stupid program and it's just a nightmare. It's just not fun at all. Okay. So if I turn on the Coco with the HXC unit in, it boots up into Disk Extended Color Basic. Now the reason it's booting into Disk Extended Color Basic is because Disk Extended Color Basic is actually in the controller. It's not on the HXC card. And it starts up, as I said before, with the file startup a.hfe. And if I go dir, we see it click and clunk, and it displays the directory. You'll notice when I do this, the track number here changes. And, well, actually this time it didn't because I was already on track 1, but if I load a file, so I'm going to load BBS, we can see the track number change to 15 to load that file. I'll go dir again, and it's going to read track 17, which is where the directory is. It shows the number of tracks on the drive, so it's got 80 tracks on that drive. 80 tracks is great because you get more storage. The problem is if you're not running an 80 track capable DOS, like RS-DOS is, I mean RS-DOS is set for 35 tracks, you can corrupt your disk images quite easily by using the wrong DOS on it. So this one's 80 tracks. The reason it's 80 tracks and I'm able to use it is because I usually run ADOS when I'm working day to day. But you know, it's something to be aware of. You can't just, you know, nothing's free on a Coco, and this is one of those things. Now, to change the file, I have to use these buttons, and this is a problem too because I don't have a case, so I have to remember which button does what. And I think this one goes up, this one goes down, and then this one's the menu. So I can go and select Startup B, all these different images I've got. Startup B underscore. Let's take a look. This is 40 tracks. Let's see what's on Startup B. Okay, so this is the Battling Traders disk. It's, you know, it's okay. It's great that I have the SD card here, but this interface is a little clunky. Now, a nice thing about this thing is that it does emulate 2 drives. So if I go dir 1, it will actually load up whatever's in drive 1. And we've got, it looks like Ultima Term is in there, and there's some, I guess this is the New World, which is another Trade Wars clone. That's nice. But changing the drive image on drive B is a nightmare. And in fact, like I just kind of click buttons and hope for the best. I can't really remember how to do this. I think I hold this center one down or something. There we go. Function menu, change drive, flip disk, rename file image. Oh my goodness. This is driving me crazy. And now I set my image for drive B, disk A 21. There we go. Now I go dir 1, and it's a different file format. I've actually used this thing on both my Model 4 and the Coco, which is nice. You can use it on both machines, but this particular file is not one for the Coco. There you have it with the HXC unit. It's great, easy to use. Nice thing about it is that, you know, it goes right into regular disk extended color basic. It by definition really has 100% compatibility with old programs. That's fantastic. But the user interface is a bit clunky. If you don't have a case here, it's a bit risky having all these wires and stuff exposed. The other nightmare with this is that, you know, while in the Coco SDC, you've got this one little box. Here I've got the unit, I've got a power supply, I've got a disk controller, I've got wires. You know, you trip over a wire, you pull it accidentally, and suddenly you've blown up your Coco. One thing I want to mention is there is a flaw in the floppy disk system. I don't know where this flaw originates, but if you power off your computer with a floppy disk in the drive, you can erase it. It gets zapped. Now the HXC is immune to this, but you'll notice when I power off the computer, it flashes like that. So there's that flash. Now that flash, if you're using a real floppy disk, will actually go to the head of the floppy drive, and you know, if conditions are just right, it will zap whatever file the head was over. So whenever you're using a real floppy disk, make sure that you open the drive tray up before you power off your computer, or else you are going to lose data. And that is the voice of experience speaking. I built a little test rig here using some of my test gear. I'm going to use this HP 5345 counter as the counter to check the timing for the various devices that I'm going to test today. And what I've actually done is I've taken a wire from the cassette port at the back of the Coco here, and there is a remote relay that was used to start and stop the cassette player back in the day. So instead of starting and stopping a cassette player, this relay has been wired up and is connected to some test gear up here. This power supply is wired in through the Coco cassette relay, which then goes into that counter. There's a gate input on the back of that counter that when there's -1 volts applied to it, opens up the gate and it starts counting. This here is the function generator. I've got it set to 100 kilohertz, which will give me some good timing and accuracy. And basically it's outputting a sine wave to the counter. So with this whole rig, the 3 devices, what will actually happen is if I type the motor on command on the Coco, it'll start that counter counting. And if I type motor off, it'll stop it counting. So I can build a little bit of a test script in order to test the speed of the different devices that I'm going to test today. Okay, so we've got the test rig here, and I'm just going to show you how the counter works when I type motor on. Motor on, and counter's counting. It's counting at 100 kilohertz. And then if I go motor off, stops counting. So this counted 7.52 seconds. I wrote a program that does some testing, so let's check that program out quickly here. Oh, drive. I'm going to turn this onto drive 1, tester, and then dir. Let's take a look here. Dir 1, great, it's there. Load, tester 1, and if we run this, it will be able to test any of our 3 devices. Let's make sure we can see this here. I've got the HXC unit wired in. I'm just going to select the correct disk. Switching disks here. Oh, it's disk 16. Okay. And then I've got floppy disk here. Disk is in the drive. And then I've got the CocoSDC. So let's check this out. So I'm going to select the drive number. We'll start with drive 2. This is the floppy disk. Now the first test is a write test, so it's going to create a 10K file. And that didn't work. Okay, let's try this again. I got to turn drive 2 off. And I got to turn drive 0 off. So the CocoSDC, I'm turning the drive off for the CocoSDC, and that will enable the external drives. Well, let's run that program again. Drive 2, and we're doing the write test. Okay, so the counter's counting. You can hear that floppy disk go. "14 seconds, 15, 16, counting away. And we got 20 seconds, 20.2208 seconds to write the 10K file. Okay, I'm going to hit enter, and this is going to read that same file. Now this test program is in BASIC, so it's going to be slower than a similar test program in assembly. BASIC is horribly slow, and you know, a certain amount of the processing time to run these tests is based on BASIC being slow as opposed to the disk itself, although, you know, the disk ain't that fast either. Okay, well, let's read in that 10K file. Reset the counter and click enter. Doing a read test. "15 seconds. 22 seconds. Still counting. And 26.6 seconds is what it took to read in that same file that I just created. Interestingly enough, read is a little bit slower than writing is. Not sure why that is, but appears to be the case. Now the final test is a test of reading a machine language file, loading it in using the loadm command, and it runs it 5 times. In between each read of the file, I have the program checking the free space on the drive. So what this is going to do is this is going to make the head move to the directory track after every load. So we'll get a test of the load speed, the actual data read speed, and we also introduce in the head seek speed, which is a big issue, certainly with a physical drive. So let's take a look and see what happens. Reset our counter, and this is our read test. And you should be able to hear that drive clicking away. That's it going between the directory and the file and loading that file over and over again. And it's done. So 13.93 seconds for that test. I'm just going to do one little check because I can't remember if that test is 10 loads or 5 loads. No, it's 10 loads. So that was to load the coterm bin file, which is about 4K long 10 times. Okay, so there's our timing for the floppy drive. So that's our baseline. Let's go to the HXC unit and check it out. So I'm going to try to get it so we can see it in the camera here somehow. My apologies, there's cords everywhere. Oh, wow, no. Oh. Brutal. Okay, well, I just blew up the floppy drive. I blew up something. Something's blown up. That's not good. Like that smoke. Okay, well, let's see if my controller's blown or not. It may very well be. So I'm going to go onto drive 0 and see what happens. Let's do our test. Drive 0. Okay. So the HXC unit is running. Fortunately, it's not blown up. Since there was actual smoke coming off of the floppy drive, I'm assuming it's broken. But the HXC unit is okay, and the drive controller is okay. So that's a good thing, because I didn't want to have that happen to me. Okay, so the HXC unit is 23 seconds, which, if I remember correctly, is a bit slower than the floppy drive. So that's very interesting that this, completely solid state unit is slower than the actual physical floppy. There's emulation. The HXC is a very accurate emulation of a floppy drive, and it even makes a sound like a floppy drive. But I guess the timings are a little bit slower than the floppy. Let's run the next test, which is our read test. See what we get. And it's reading the file. One thing I always hated about the Coco was that, this rig here with wires everywhere and that I just blew up a floppy drive, this is normal on the Coco layout. It drove me crazy as a kid, and it's one reason why I'm going to eventually put my Coco in some sort of sane case, so that there's just like a keyboard and floppy drives all connected up nicely. There's no wires anywhere, and I'll just leave it sitting for the next 10 years and have that as my go-to computer. Anyways, test results are back. So we got 26.89 seconds, which is slower, as I remember it, than the floppy drive. If I remember the floppy drive, it was around 22 seconds when we ran that test. So the HXC is a bit slower there for read and write. Now I'm going to do the assembly language load, and this includes the shift back and forth to the directory track. So it's running, and you can hear it. You might be able to hear it, and you might be able to see it going back and forth, reading that track. And we got 20 seconds, 20.22 seconds to read that file, which is significantly slower than the floppy disk. quite interesting. There we go, there's the HXC unit. Our last test is going to be the Coco SDC, so let's run this program one more time. And we're going to run it on drive 1. And this is going to be our write test of 10K. Running, running, running. See the lights flashing on the Coco SDC. And we got 13.16 seconds, which is significantly faster than both the other drives. The next test is our read test. So let's try that out. This is reading the file back one line at a time in BASIC. And we are at 13 seconds, which was about what it took to write the file. 16, 17, 18, 19 seconds pretty much, 18.97 seconds. So again, definitely faster than the other two drives. Okay, the final test is going to be that read of the binary file 10 times in a loop. And this includes moving back to the directory track every time. And we have 3.29 seconds. So it basically blew both the HXC and the floppy drive out of the water. Now I'm going to make a quick guess why that's the case. Why was this so much faster? The reason is, I'm guessing, is that this unit here, to do a track seek, basically takes 0 time at all. So to go back to track 17, the directory, it doesn't take any time. And because of that, it's just way faster. And then if we combine in, you know, probably a quicker data rate overall, it just blows away the physical device and it blows away the HXC. Okay, now let's take a look at the results of our test. There's a couple of calculations that I made based on these numbers. The first is the average kilobytes per second. The floppy drive gives you an average kilobytes per second of 1.2 KB per second. It's pretty embarrassing, but I mean, you know, hey, it's over 30 years old for this computer. The HXC doesn't even do 1 kilobyte per second. It's at 0.95. And the Coco SDC is at 4.59. So it's a lot faster on average than the other two devices. Where it really gets interesting is cost. If you consider that the floppy drive is going to cost you about $200, you know, give or take a few dollars to get into, it looks like it's going to be about $160 per kilobyte per second. The HXC is even more expensive, and the reason it's more expensive is because, you know, not only do you need the HXC, you need a drive controller, you need a power supply, you also need a SD card to put on the HXC, and it's considerably slower than the floppy on average. So the dollars per kilobyte per second is 226. Lastly, we have the Coco SDC, which basically is a lot cheaper. It works out to about $80 US with an SD card. And it's a lot faster. So, you know, you can see the magic of modern technology here. And our dollars per kilobyte per second is only $18. If we look purely from a financial perspective, the Coco SDC is the clear winner. It's an order of magnitude cheaper than the other options on the market. I think the clear winner for storage for the Coco is the Coco SDC. The price point is good. It is robust, it is compact, there's no wires you have to worry about, it reads a standard format SD card, there's no software you have to worry about, it is fast, it is a great solution. My only criticism is that I can only mount 2 disk images at a time. I should be able to mount 4 or even more. I'd like the developers, you know, if you're thinking about an upgrade, that would be a really good solution, really good thing to offer people, because, you know, not everyone wants to use physical floppy disks, and certainly not everyone wants to use drive wire. Other than that, I think this is a great choice. If you have a Coco, this is going to change, you know, the amount of fun that you have with that machine. It makes it a totally different experience. I think it's really well worth the money. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you like what you see here, you know, please subscribe. Really means a lot to me. And for people who already are subscribers, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. See you next time.